In this world, legitimacy is not a social concept. It is a biological doctrine embedded into governance itself. Every institution, from the smallest pack council to the highest royal court, operates under an unspoken but absolute principle. Blood determines authority before competence is ever evaluated. Rank is not earned in the modern sense of meritocracy, but recognized through lineage confirmation rituals, genetic resonance, and inherited political continuity. The result is a society that appears structured and stable on the surface, but is in fact governed by an inherited bias that filters who is allowed to matter. Within this system, Sarah exists as an anomaly that the system has already resolved in advance. She is competent enough to be strategically indispensable, trusted in combat design, border strategy, and advisory planning, yet structurally invisible in any higher hierarchy that defines ownership of power. Her contributions are absorbed upward, attributed elsewhere, and normalized as background function rather than authorship. In practical terms, she is a high-performance asset without formal recognition. Valuable only insofar as she reinforces the success of others who possess legitimate lineage. This contradiction is not treated as injustice by the system. It is treated as stability, because the system is not designed to reward capability. It is designed to preserve continuity of blood-defined authority. Her relationship with Darian Voss exists entirely inside this logic. On the surface, it is structured as a bond. Formal, recognized, and politically functional. He represents the visible apex of Ironvale's hierarchy, an alpha whose legitimacy is unquestioned due to pure blood lineage and inherited command authority. She, in contrast, operates as an embedded intelligence layer beneath his authority. Planning strategies he later presents, refining war tactics he formally approves, and stabilizing political negotiations he publicly leads. To the outside world, they appear synchronized. But internally, the structure is fundamentally asymmetrical. Darian does not experience Sarah as an equal participant in authority. He experiences her as an extension of his capacity. Even when he acknowledges her intelligence, it is framed within the assumption that legitimacy must still flow through him to exist socially. This creates a subtle but constant distortion in their dynamic. She generates decisions, but he owns outcomes. Over time, this asymmetry becomes normalized rather than questioned. The system reinforces it at every level. Council protocols require visible lineage for official recognition. Historical records attribute strategic success to alpha leadership, regardless of internal contribution. Even battlefield victories are puppeted into pack memory through names that align with recognized bloodlines rather than operational architects. Sarah adapts to this structure not out of ignorance, but out of functional survival. She understands the rule with precision. Being correct is not enough to be real in this system, so she becomes efficient within invisibility. What the system does not account for is the accumulation effect of suppressed recognition. Every unacknowledged decision, every misattributed success, every moment of erased authorship does not disappear. It consolidates into a latent structural pressure within her identity. By the time the public severance occurs, she is not simply losing a partner. She is being forcibly removed from a framework in which she has been functioning as an invisible pillar of stability for 6 years. And the system assumes this removal is harmless. That assumption becomes the first structural error in the architecture of legitimacy that governs Ironvale. Because Sarah does not collapse when she is made invisible, she begins to observe the system from outside its assumptions. And that shift, subtle, silent, and not yet fully conscious, marks the beginning of a deeper instability within a world that believed bloodline was an unbreakable definition of value. The severance was not announced as punishment. It was presented as procedure. Iron Vale's great hall had already been prepared hours in advance, not for chaos, but for controlled observation. Every seat was occupied in calibrated hierarchy. Elders positioned for authority validation, warriors arranged for behavioral reinforcement, and visiting representatives seated where perception could be shaped rather than questioned. Nothing in the room was accidental. Even silence had been assigned a function. Sarah entered without hesitation. There was no escort, no delay, no ritual delay meant to heighten emotional breakdown. That, too, was intentional. The system did not require spectacle to achieve compliance. It required witnessed clarity. The goal was not to humiliate her in chaos, but to render her status obsolete in a space where legitimacy was already predefined. Darian Voss stood at the center. He did not look conflicted. That would have implied instability. Instead, he maintained a calibrated stillness. An alpha conditioned to perform authority without visible friction. The bond between them had always been structurally functional. But here, in this space, it was being reclassified before it was even spoken. Sarah stopped 3 steps away. The distance was not emotional. It was procedural. Both understood it. Darian began the severance rite in the old tongue, each syllable carrying institutional weight older than either of them. The language was not designed for persuasion. It was designed for finality without debate. Around them, the hall did not react. That was the first signal. No outrage, no sympathy, no visible fracture in perception, only alignment. The crowd was not witnessing a breakup. They were witnessing a system correcting an anomaly. When Darian shifted into common speech, his tone softened. Not into cruelty, but into something more efficient. Narrative control. He framed the severance as protection of lineage integrity, as necessity rather than choice. Each sentence reduced Sarah's presence in the social structure by 1 degree of legitimacy, carefully, incrementally, until she was no longer being removed, but released. The word landed cleanly: release, not exile, not rejection. Release. The linguistic substitution mattered more than the act itself. It transformed removal into benevolence, erasing friction from perception. Sarah did not interrupt. She did not plead. She did not correct. That absence of reaction was the only deviation in the room's expected pattern. And even that was quickly absorbed by the system as composure under adjustment, a trait rather than a resistance. Inside her, nothing collapsed loudly. There was no emotional rupture that the hall could register. Instead, something more precise occurred: disassociation from assigned identity roles. She observed Darian speaking, as if recounting a shared history that no longer required her participation. She registered the audience's micro-adjustments, subtle nods, lowered gazes, the collective decision to accept the framing being offered, not because they believed it fully, but because disbelief required cost, and the system rewarded alignment. This was how legitimacy functioned. Not through truth, through consensus stability. When the rite concluded, there was no ceremonial closure, no symbolic gesture, only procedural completion. The bond was no longer acknowledged. Therefore, it no longer existed within institutional reality. Darian looked away first. It was brief, almost imperceptible. But in a system built on dominance signaling, even a fraction of redirected gaze carried structural meaning. Sarah turned toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one needed to. The system had already validated the outcome. And as she crossed the threshold of Iron Vale's gates, she did not feel devastation in the way the observers expected to interpret it. She felt something quieter, a recalibration of what it meant to be seen, and what it meant to no longer be defined by being seen at all. Sarah did not leave immediately. She remained within the perimeter of Iron Vale, long enough for the system to assume compliance had already stabilized. From an external perspective, nothing about her behavior indicated rupture. There were no visible signs of breakdown, no emotional spillover, no performative reaction that the surrounding observers could categorize as instability. Instead, what manifested was something far more difficult for the system to interpret: methodical observation under emotional absence. She walked through the transitional corridors between the Great Hall and the outer gates with measured precision. Not because she was calm, but because emotional reaction had ceased to provide useful input. Every step functioned as data collection. The environment that once felt familiar now appeared restructured under a different logic. Not changed, but revealed. She began noticing inconsistencies that had always existed, but were previously filtered out by internal trust assumptions. How people shifted their posture when rank symbols passed by. How conversations collapsed into silence at the approach of certain bloodlines. How institutional language replaced intention with acceptable phrasing. What had once been normal was now visibly constructed. At the same time, she registered the severance event not as an emotional rupture, but as a classification update. Something in her internal model of identity had been removed from the system's active registry, and yet she was still functioning without collapse. This contradiction created the first true fracture in her self-perception. If identity loss did not result in emotional disintegration, then identity itself was not what she had believed it to be. It was not stable, it was assigned, and assignments could be changed. This realization did not arrive as shock, it arrived as structure. Her cognitive state reorganized around it almost immediately. Instead of asking why this hurts, she began asking what conditions made this possible without resistance from the system itself. The question shifted from emotional causality to systemic architecture, and in doing so, detached her further from the expected grief response. The absence of pain was not peace. It was recalibration. The deeper she moved away from Ironvale's central zone, the clearer the underlying mechanism became. The severance had not been an isolated interpersonal decision. It had been executed with institutional synchronization. The timing, the crowd alignment, the linguistic framing, the absence of procedural friction, all of it indicated coordination beyond Darien alone, which meant the rejection was not personal. It was structural, and that introduced the first persistent anomaly in her analysis. If she had been removed so cleanly, then her presence must have been accounted for in advance as something requiring eventual removal. Not because of failure, but because of incompatibility with an unseen layer of the system. That thought did not provoke anger. It produced a quiet, sustained cognitive pressure. By the time she reached the outer boundary, she had already formed her first actionable conclusion. Remaining inside the system would no longer provide accurate information about her own condition. Continued proximity would only reinforce inherited interpretations of selfhood that had just proven unreliable. So she made the decision to exit, not as escape, but as data correction. As she crossed beyond the threshold marker, she did not look back. The system behind her continued operating exactly as before, as if nothing significant had occurred. That continuity was the final confirmation she needed. Whatever had been removed from her identity profile was still stable enough for the system to function without visible disturbance. Which meant the real question was no longer about rejection. It was about design, and somewhere within that design, a truth had been deliberately excluded from her perception, for reasons the system did not yet need her to understand. Why was she really rejected so cleanly and publicly? The question did not fade as she walked away. It stabilized and began to persist as the first open loop she could no longer ignore. The rain was not symbolic. It did not arrive as mood, nor as metaphor, nor as emotional reinforcement of internal state. It simply existed as a neutral environmental condition, dense, indifferent, and continuous, erasing the distinction between movement and stillness through its persistence. Sarah stood beneath it without seeking shelter, not because she had chosen exposure, but because the concept of shelter no longer registered as a priority variable in her decision hierarchy. The transition zone outside Ironvale was structurally unmarked. There were no ceremonial boundaries, no visible declaration of departure, only a gradual thinning of institutional presence, fewer patrol signatures, fewer identification checkpoints, fewer language markers that defined status. The system did not announce where it ended. It simply reduced its enforcement density until reality itself began to feel unmonitored. This was the threshold, a space where identity was no longer actively maintained by external validation. Her body registered the cold, the moisture, the friction of fabric against skin. But these inputs were processed without emotional interpretation. The earlier rupture had not evolved into grief or shock. Instead, it had stabilized into a post-system cognitive state, where emotional labeling no longer activated automatically. She observed this with detached clarity. The absence of expected emotional response was not experienced as loss. It was experienced as recalibration efficiency. Each step forward away from Ironvale reduced the residual interference of institutional definitions, names, ranks, relational classifications. All of them began to lose semantic weight. They still existed in memory, but they no longer carried operational authority over perception. This was the first time she understood, with structural certainty, that the system had never simply described her. It had been continuously maintaining her. And now that maintenance had ceased, nothing immediate replaced it. The world did not collapse without the system. It simply became undefined. In that undefined space, Sarah's mind began reconstructing itself through observation rather than assignment. Instead of asking us what she was supposed to feel, she tracked what she was actually processing. Temperature gradients, spatial depth, sound diffusion through rainfall, the absence of hierarchical cues in surrounding movement. Everything became equivalent data, even herself. At the edge of perception, she recognized a dangerous clarity forming. If identity required continuous external reinforcement to remain stable, then most of what she had considered self was not internal truth, but repeated confirmation loops produced by environment and authority. The realization did not destabilize her. It clarified her. A part of her expected grief to surface as delayed reaction, some emotional echo of severance. But nothing arrived in the expected form. Instead, there was only a precise awareness that something fundamental had been removed without resistance, and yet the structure beneath it was still functioning. That contradiction became the emotional peak. Not pain, not sadness, but recognition that what had been labeled her identity had been externally curated to the point where its removal felt less like destruction and more like exposure. She stopped walking for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of analytical interruption. Because for the first time, the question formed without emotional distortion. Why had the removal been so complete, so coordinated, so clean? No residue conflict, no visible factional disagreement, no systemic instability, only alignment. And systems did not usually align this efficiently, unless the target had already been pre-processed for removal long before the final act. The implication was not comforting. It suggested that the version of her life she had just exited had never been fully autonomous in the first place. And somewhere beyond the rain, beyond Ironvale's jurisdiction, that realization began to settle into a single persistent structure. She had not simply been rejected. She had been reclassified out of necessity the system had not yet disclosed. The rain had not changed its intensity, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer a boundary condition of transition. It had become a neutral backdrop against which recognition errors could be measured. Sarah registered this shift without assigning it emotional value. The world beyond Ironvale remained structurally undefined, yet increasingly legible through observation rather than inherited classification. She was still processing the absence of institutional identity markers. When she noticed him, he did not arrive in a way that suggested entry. There was no sound pattern of approach, no visual announcement of movement, no disruption in environmental continuity that typically preceded the presence of authority figures in Ironvale adjacent zones. Instead, his position simply existed within the frame of her perception, as if it had always been compatible with it. That alone was the first anomaly. He stood a short distance away, neither blocking her path nor offering it. His posture carried no urgency, no evaluation, no performative dominance. If anything, his stillness resembled something closer to calibration than observation, as though the environment had already been accounted for and required no further adjustment. Sarah did not react, not because she trusted him, but because her cognitive system had not yet categorized him as either threat or assistance. This delay in classification created a rare moment of perceptual imbalance. Most individuals within a system like Ironvale were immediately sorted into predictable roles: authority, subordinate, asset, or risk. This man resisted all four without generating interpretive strain. That resistance was not confusion. It was structured absence of signaling. He looked at her the way one might regard a variable that has already been observed in prior states. Not with curiosity, not with surprise, with recognition. And that recognition was precisely what created tension. Because Sarah could detect no logical pathway by which he should recognize her at all. Her status had just been publicly severed. Her identity had been procedurally invalidated. Her existence, within institutional logic, had been downgraded to non-operational relevance, yet this man's gaze did not reflect any of those outcomes. It reflected continuity, as if none of the recent system events had meaningfully altered his internal model of her. That discrepancy did not resolve into comfort. It resolved into structural uncertainty. He finally spoke, but not as an introduction. There was no greeting, no inquiry, no attempt to establish relational framing. His words were minimal, almost compressed, as if language itself was being used only to confirm alignment between expectation and reality. And still, he did not explain why he was there. He did not ask what had happened at Ironvale. He did not request confirmation of identity. He simply acknowledged her presence in a way that implied prior knowledge without exposing its source. Sarah remained still, rain continuing to break across both of them without distinction. In that moment, the most unsettling element was not his calmness, nor his lack of reaction to her condition. It was the absence of ignorance. Because in every system she had known, recognition was always preceded by information transfer. But here, recognition appeared to exist independently of it. And that introduced a contradiction her current model could not resolve. If he already knew her, then the system had failed to contain information it was designed to control. Or worse, the system had never been fully controlling it in the first place. He did not move closer. He did not step back. He remained precisely where he was, as though proximity itself had already been decided long before either of them arrived at this boundary. And Sarah, standing in the rain, understood something without yet being able to articulate it. This man was not reacting to her arrival in the outside world. He was reacting as if Ishi had always been part of a scenario that had simply reached its next phase. And that made him not a rescuer, not an intruder, not an ally, but a known variable inside a structure she had not yet learned to see. The rain had weakened into a persistent residue rather than an active force, clinging to surfaces instead of striking them. In this diminished state, it no longer defined the environment. It merely documented it. Sarah remained standing at a distance that suggested neither approach nor retreat. The Alpha King did not move closer. He did not attempt to close the gap created by uncertainty, nor did he attempt to widen it. His position remained fixed, as if spatial relations between them had already been resolved in a framework. Neither of them was actively negotiating. There was no initiation ritual from his side, no explanation, no inquiry into her condescension, no reaction to the implications of what she had just left behind. That absence of procedural engagement was not negligence. It was recognition of an already defined state. Sarah processed this quickly, not emotionally, but structurally. The severance from Ironvale had created a vacuum of definition, and within that vacuum, every interaction now carried disproportionate weight. Words were no longer social, they were architectural. So when she spoke, it was not as a request, it was as a recalibration. "I need a binding contract." The phrasing was precise. Not marriage in the cultural sense, not alliances in the political sense, not even protection in the transactional sense. It was a defined mechanism of access, legal, recognized, and structurally binding within systems that still required identity anchoring. Her tone carried no emotional signaling. There was no invitation embedded in it, only function, a mechanism to stabilize her position within a system that had just removed her from all prior definitions of legitimacy. For the first time, the Alpha King responded with minimal delay. Not surprise, not evaluation, not hesitation. Acceptance. He did not ask why. He did not ask under what conditions. He did not negotiate scope, duration, or consequence. The agreement arrived as a single completed action, as if the input had already been anticipated long before it was spoken. Accepted. That was all. The simplicity of it created a distortion in perception rather than resolution. In most systems Sarah had operated within, binding contracts of this magnitude required layered verification, political consultation, risk assessment, lineage compatibility, and ideological alignment. Even symbolic unions carried procedural friction. Here, there was none. The absence of resistance was not comforting. It was structurally disorienting. Sarah studied him carefully, but found no emotional leakage to interpret. No satisfaction, no dominance display, no attempt to reframe the decision as victory or control. He treated the agreement as finalized infrastructure, not relational escalation. This lack of interpretive cues forced a cognitive correction inside her analysis. If this were an ordinary encounter, acceptance without conditions would be irrational, which meant one of two conclusions had to be true. Either he possessed information she did not, or the structure they were operating within was not as local as it appeared. Neither conclusion could be immediately validated, but both destabilized the assumption that this decision was spontaneous. For the first time, a subtle discontinuity formed in her perception of the encounter. What had initially registered as coincidence now resembled alignment. Not emotional alignment, but systemic synchronization. Like two variables converging on a result that had been computed elsewhere. The Alpha King finally shifted his gaze, not toward her face, but slightly beyond it, as if referencing a layer of context she could not yet access. Still, he offered no explanation. And in that silence, the perception shift completed itself without announcement. This was not a random meeting between a displaced individual and an external authority. This was a continuation of something already in motion. Sarah did not yet know what structure she had entered, but she now understood the more important constraint. The man in front of her was not reacting to her decision. He was executing within parameters that had already accounted for it. The city did not announce itself through scale. It revealed itself through structure. As Sarah crossed into the governed interior zones beyond the transitional boundary, the environment did not shift dramatically in appearance. Instead, it shifted in behavioral consistency. Roads aligned with unnerving precision. Movement patterns of people followed non-random distributions. Even silence between conversations appeared calibrated rather than incidental. This was not a place that simply had rules. It was a place where rules actively maintained visibility. The court district emerged gradually, not as a singular landmark, but as a convergence of controlled spatial logic. Architecture here did not prioritize grandeur for aesthetic dominance. It prioritized readability of hierarchy. Every elevation change, every corridor width, every open-air threshold functioned as an encoded signal of status differentiation. Sarah registered this without emotional framing. Her cognitive state remained in observational mode, still operating under the post-system recalibration that had begun after Iron Veil. But here, that mode encountered resistance. Not external resistance, but structural interference. Inputs that did not map cleanly onto her existing interpretation model. The first anomaly occurred at the gate. Her identity verification was not rejected, nor was it accepted in the conventional sense. It was acknowledged, then rerouted. Instead of a binary response, access granted denied, the system produced a third state, procedural ambiguity. The guards did not question her presence. The interface did not flag her as unauthorized. Yet the usual hierarchy-based routing protocols failed to assign her a stable category. She was, for a brief moment, unclassified within a classified system. That should not have been possible. Inside Iron Veil, identity was rigid but traceable. Outside, identity was absent but irrelevant. Here, identity was expected to be both present and precisely defined. Her existence disrupted that expectation without triggering correction. The result was not conflict. It was hesitation embedded into the system itself. She continued forward. The court interior expanded into layered governance space. Audience, chambers, administrative corridors, and elevated observation platforms arranged in nested visibility tiers. Every movement she made was registered, but not interpreted with consistency. Some observers reacted with formal acknowledgement. Others paused mid-action, as if their internal classification processes required additional cycles. No one intervened. That, too, was an anomaly. In a system this structured, ambiguity should have triggered containment. Instead, it propagated quietly through the environment like an unresolved variable affecting surrounding calculations. Sarah began to notice a pattern. Rules here were not failing, they were recalculating in real time based on her presence. Not because she held authority, but because her identity did not resolve into any pre-existing category with sufficient confidence for stable enforcement. At the center of the court complex, a secondary threshold appeared, less physical barrier, more procedural checkpoint. This was where governance decisions were typically finalized, where identity definitions were either reinforced or corrected. When she approached it, the system responded again, not with denial, not with acceptance, but with delay. A measurable pause in processing that extended beyond acceptable operational variance. For the first time since leaving Iron Veil, Sarah experienced something that resembled external system instability. Not as chaos, but as uncertainty at the level of institutional logic. This was not about her emotional state. It was about the system's inability to finalize a stable definition of her existence within its framework. And that realization introduced a deeper structural implication. If rules behaved differently around her, without explicit authorization, then she was not merely moving through a system. She was interacting with a system that was actively adapting its rules to accommodate her unresolved classification, and somewhere within that adaptation, a higher-level structure was silently acknowledging her presence without yet deciding what she was allowed to become. The court did not open a room for her. It reconfigured access around her, instead of being guided through formal introduction protocols. Sarah found herself moving through a sequence of spaces that appeared pre-cleared. Doors unlocking not in response to authority recognition, but in response to absence of rejection. No one escorted her, no one explained her placement. She was simply permitted to proceed, as if her trajectory had already been accounted for in advance. The Alpha King remained beside her, but not in a guiding role. He did not lead, he did not interpret, he did not translate the environment into meaning. He only adjusted his pace when necessary to maintain alignment with her movement, as though proximity itself had already been calculated into the structure they were both operating within. When Sarah attempted to map the environment using familiar logic, the system resisted interpretation. Governance halls were visible, but their function labels were partially redacted. Council routes existed, but their access hierarchies were inconsistent. Information boards displayed institutional data, but selectively, as if entire sections of context had been intentionally omitted from perceptual availability. This was not concealment in the traditional sense. It was curated incompleteness. The Alpha King stopped at a junction where multiple corridors intersected. Without speaking, he placed a small data slate into her hand. No explanation followed, no instruction, no framing of purpose. Sarah looked at it. The interface did not contain narrative. There was no introduction file, no contextual summary, no guidance layer. Instead, it contained segmented records. Partial logs of identity classification events, fragmented legal annotations, and incomplete lineage references that terminated mid-entry, as if the remaining portions had been deliberately removed rather than lost. She did not look at him for clarification. He would not provide it. That much had already been established. Instead, she focused on structure. Each fragment followed a pattern of controlled disclosure, enough information to suggest systemic coherence, but insufficient to reconstruct full causality. It was not misinformation. It was bounded truth architecture, data-shaped to prevent premature conclusion. This realization produced a subtle shift in her cognitive processing. She was not being denied access. She was being given filtered access, calibrated to her current state of comprehension stability. The implication was more significant than the data itself. It meant the system had a model of her cognition, and it was actively regulating exposure based on it. Sarah scrolled through another fragment. A reference to identity registration protocols. Another partial entry referencing non-standard lineage anomaly classification. Then says to cut off sentence mid-definition, as if the system had decided continuation was not yet permitted. Behind her, the court continued its silent operations. No alarms, no corrections, no attempts to reassert standard informational hierarchy. Only controlled normalcy surrounding an abnormal information gradient centered on her. The Alpha King finally spoke, but only once. Not to explain, only to anchor interpretation. Do not read it as history, that was all. No elaboration followed. The instruction was not guidance. It was constraint framing, a warning against treating fragmented data as complete narrative, against constructing premature coherence from deliberately incomplete systems. Sarah understood immediately what this meant. The information was not meant to inform her about the past. It was meant to change how she would interpret the present. She closed the slate halfway, not out of confusion, but out of recognition that every fragment she had seen was part of a controlled exposure sequence designed to incrementally shift her perception threshold without triggering collapse or premature synthesis. For the first time, she considered the possibility that her presence here was not simply being observed, it was being managed through staged epistemic release, and the Alpha King, silent, unreadable, non-reactive, was not withholding truth out of concealment. He was controlling the velocity at which truth could safely exist inside her understanding. That distinction was critical because it reframed everything she had experienced so far, not as secrecy, but as calibration. The anomaly did not announce itself as an event. It appeared as a pattern deviation inside ordinary procedural flow. Sarah first noticed it during a standard identity pass at a mid-level governance checkpoint. The interaction was supposed to be routine: visual confirmation, registry alignment, and categorical routing into the court's internal access layers. Instead, the system paused, briefly, but measurably, before completing its scan. Not rejection, not approval. A delay that had no procedural label. The guard repeated the scan without expression. The second result did not correct the first. It only deepened the inconsistency. The system was no longer treating her identity as a fixed input. It was re-evaluating her as if the input itself were changing. Sarah did not react externally. Internally, she shifted into structured observation. This was not the first time she had encountered systems recalculating her status, but it was the first time the recalibration appeared to originate at a level below administrative logic, biological layer indexing, not social recognition, not political classification, something closer to structural resonance. As she moved deeper into the court's inner registry halls, the anomalies multiplied. Census gates designed to confirm population continuity stalled when her presence was registered. Not blocked, stalled, as if the system required additional time to reconcile her existence against stored baselines that no longer matched current input. One clerk looked at her identification slate, then at her directly, then back again. Not confusion, mismatch, as if the data and the physical subject were failing to align under a shared definition of identity. No one explained it. No correction was issued. The process simply advanced past her, as though the system had decided to accept unresolved variance rather than resolve it. That was the second anomaly. Tolerance of inconsistency. Sarah began to track the pattern consciously. Every time she entered a structured verification zone, the same sequence repeated: initial recognition, micro-delay, recalculation, partial acceptance, silence. No alarms, no flags, no escalation protocols. Just quiet instability embedded inside otherwise stable operations. And beneath it, something more disturbing. The system was not only reacting to her presence, it was reacting to her as if her biological structure carried classification weight that had not been declared in any accessible registry. That meant either her data had been altered externally at scale, or the system she was interacting with was not referencing a complete version of reality. Neither interpretation should have been possible within a controlled governance architecture. At the third checkpoint, the anomaly became visible to her directly. A warding interface, used to confirm lineage resonance and structural compatibility, activated automatically as she passed. Normally, it would display a simple pass-fail alignment based on pre-registered genetic markers. Instead, it flickered, then expanded, then collapsed, then reappeared with a modified schema she had never seen before. Not human-readable logic, not institutional protocol, something closer to adaptive classification responding in real time to her proximity. A junior officials stepped back instinctively. No explanation followed. No one addressed the change. But the reaction in the room was no longer neutral. it had shifted into silent uncertainty. Sarah felt it then. Not emotion, but structural implication forming at scale. The system was not simply failing to categorize her. It was revising its own categorization rules in response to her existence. And that possibility introduced the first coherent fracture in her internal model of reality. If the rules changed around her without authorization, then the rules had never been fully fixed. And if they had never been fixed, then her entire life under Iron Veil's classification structure may have been built on a system that was already incomplete at the moment it defined her. The thought did not arrive as shock. It arrived as conclusion pressure. A final layer settled beneath all prior observations, forming a single persistent question that no procedural system had yet answered. Why does the system react to her biologically and structurally as if she was never fully defined in the first place? And as she moved deeper into the court, past silent officials and unstable classification gates, she began to suspect something far more precise than rejection or concealment. Rejection or concealment. Her life may not have been misunderstood. It may have been constructed from an incomplete narrative architecture from the very beginning. The archive was not hidden. It was misaligned. Sarah entered the archival wing, expecting controlled access protocols, a structured repository of governance records, consistent with everything she had observed so far. Instead, she encountered a system that behaved as though her presence required continuous reconfiguration of what could and could not be shown. The interface responded normally at first. Search authorization granted. Category filters available. Historical index layers accessible. But the moment she queried her own identity lineage, the system did something that did not fit any standard denial pattern. It did not refuse. It fragmented. Records appeared, then immediately destabilized. Entire entries loaded only partially before collapsing into redacted voids. Names were visible for less than a second, before being overwritten by classification tags that did not match any known registry hierarchy. Dates existed without events. Events existed without actors. Lineage trees rendered incomplete branches that terminated mid-structure, as if the system had deliberately removed continuity rather than stored absence. Sarah did not move quickly. She adjusted to the inconsistency the way she had learned to adjust to systemic anomalies, by shifting from interpretive reading to structural observation. Each fragment contained partial coherence, but no complete narrative survived intact. One entry referenced a genetic sovereignty deviation event. Another labeled a non-registered royal continuity vector. A third contained only a single line before deletion threshold. Subject classification removed from public continuity index under. The sentence ended there. Not lost. Cut. The pattern repeated across every layer she accessed. The deeper she went, the more the system behaved like a structure actively resisting reconstruction of a single, unified truth. It was not protecting information. It was enforcing non-completion, as if full understanding itself had been marked as an unauthorized outcome. Behind her, the archive hall remained silent. No alarms triggered, no custodians intervened. That absence of reaction was itself another anomaly. If the system were merely hiding data, it would restrict access. If it were corrupted, it would fail uniformly. But what Sarah was observing was neither restriction nor failure. It was selective coherence collapse, triggered specifically by her attempts to assemble continuity around her own identity. She began to trace patterns across fragments instead of reading them individually. The inconsistencies were not random. They converged. Multiple records referenced the same missing classification event, but none agreed on its outcome. Some indicated erasure. Others indicated reassignment. A few suggested relocation beyond recognized governance boundaries. All versions shared one structural constant. Her identity had been actively processed by the system at a level above ordinary administrative hierarchy, which meant the erasure was not accidental. It was governed. At some point during the review, a secondary interface layer activated without her request. This layer did not belong to standard archival architecture. It was older, slower, and structurally incompatible with current court systems. It displayed a single classification line: subject, Sarah, stat, unresolved, origin. Below it, additional metadata attempted to load. It failed, not due to absence of data, but due to refusal of resolution. Sarah stared at the incomplete line without emotional reaction. But internally, something shifted. No longer analytical observation alone, but a deeper cognitive reorganization. If her origin could not be resolved within the system that governed identity, then her life had never been fully integrated into the framework she had been operating under. And if that was true, then every interaction, every recognition, every rejection, every social validation or dismissal she had experienced was built on top of an identity construct that was never complete to begin with. The implication did not arrive as shock. It arrived as structural collapse of assumed continuity. She closed the interface, not because she had finished reading, but because continuing would not produce answers, only deeper fragmentation. As the archive system returned to baseline state, the final inconsistency became clear. The system did not store her history. It only stored attempts to define her, none of which were allowed to remain intact. And somewhere beyond the layers of redaction and structural deletion, a more fundamental question emerged. One the archive itself could not answer, because it had been designed to never reach completion. What kind of entity requires its own history to remain perpetually unresolved? The corridor beyond the archive was quieter than it should have been, not silent. Quiet in a way that suggested suppression of operational noise rather than absence of activity. Systems still ran beneath the surface, but their outputs were no longer expressive. Everything had shifted into constrained execution mode, as if the environment itself had reduced informational leakage around her presence. The Alpha King stopped walking only when the structural density of the space changed. It was not a door nor a chamber. It was a threshold where information access protocols tightened, where even architectural transparencies began to degrade into selective opacity. Sarah noticed immediately that this was not a place designed for public governance. It was a containment layer for interpretive risk. He finally spoke, not as explanation, as calibration. "You have seen fragments." The statement was not a question. It was a verification of state alignment. Sarah did not respond immediately. She had learned that with him, response timing mattered less than response precision. He continued before she could classify his intent. What you accessed in the archive is not missing data. It is controlled absence. That distinction mattered. Missing data implied failure. Controlled absence implied governance. Sarah's cognitive model adjusted accordingly. He did not look at her directly when he spoke. Instead, his attention remained distributed across the environment, as if monitoring multiple interpretive layers simultaneously. That behavior itself implied constraint. Not emotional restraint, but structural limitation in what could safely be expressed within proximity to her current state. "You are not supposed to reconstruct it fully yet," he added. Still no explanation of why. Still no disclosure of what it referred to at its highest resolution. Sarah finally broke silence. "Because I'm not ready to understand it?" A pause. Not hesitation in speech, but calculation in disclosure boundary. That is not the reason. That answer created more instability than silence would have. It eliminated the assumption of personal limitation and replaced it with structural restriction. something external, something systemic, something that did not depend on her readiness at all. The Alpha King finally turned slightly, not toward her face, but toward the space between them, as if addressing an invisible framework rather than a person. What you are approaching intersects with multiple governance layers that do not operate under the same disclosure logic. He stopped again, not because he had finished, but because continuation would exceed permissible exposure. Sarah understood that immediately. This was not ignorance on his part, this was constraint. He was not withholding information because he chose to. He was operating under limits that defined how much of the structure could safely be reflected into her awareness at once. That realization reframed him completely, not as controller of truth, but as a constrained node inside a larger system of controlled disclosure. She studied him with renewed precision. For the first time, she was not evaluating what he knew, but what he was allowed to transmit. "And the binding contract?" she asked quietly. Another pause. This one longer. "Not emotional weight, but boundary tension. Was a stabilizing interface," he said finally. That phrasing mattered. Interface, not bond. Stabilizing, not relational. Sarah's understanding tightened. She had not entered a romantic or political structure. She had entered an access protocol disguised as social form. Her existence required anchoring within a system that otherwise could not maintain consistent classification around her, which meant her presence was not simply unusual. It was operationally destabilizing at scale. The Alpha King continued, voice lower now. "I can show you fragments. I cannot give you resolution, a direct admission of constraint, not evasion, not mystery building, limitation, and in that limitation lay the most important truth so far. He knew the architecture, but he did not own the authority to fully expose it." Sarah looked past him toward the corridor they had come through, where archive layers still echoed with incomplete records and structurally broken identities. For the first time, the pattern aligned across all observations: archive fragmentation, system anomalies, identity instability, controlled information exposure. Each was not independent behavior. Each was part of a single governance principle. Truth was not hidden. It was metered. And the Alpha King, despite his authority, his awareness, his calm certainty, was also operating inside that metering constraint. The realization settled quietly but decisively. He was not above the system. He was one of its most informed limitations. And whatever lay beyond the fragments she had seen was not being withheld because of secrecy. It was being withheld because full exposure would exceed what reality itself was currently permitted to stabilize around her understanding. The instability did not begin as an event. It began as a failure of continuity. Sarah noticed it first in the simplest act of recall. Names that had once carried clear relational weight. Darien, Ironvale. Even her own internal designation within administrative records no longer aligned cleanly with the emotional and structural tags previously attached to them. They were still present in memory, but their interpretive function had begun to degrade. Not deletion, decoupling. As she moved deeper into the governance interior, the phenomenon intensified. Each system layer she passed through required a reaffirmation of identity that no longer produced consistent results. Some interfaces recognized her. Others partially recognized her. A few treated her as structurally adjacent to known classifications, without fully mapping her into them. The effect was cumulative. Identity was no longer operating as a single, coherent anchor. It was fragmenting into competing interpretations, none of which fully stabilized. She stopped for the first time in a transitional corridor between two administrative wings. Not because she was lost, because the concept of lost required a stable reference point, and that reference point was no longer fully accessible. Her internal cognitive model attempted reconstruction automatically. It pulled from archival fragments, from observed system reactions, from Alpha King's constrained disclosures. But each attempt produced only partial convergence, never resolution. She began to recognize a more unsettling pattern beneath the instability. The system was not simply uncertain about her identity. It was actively producing multiple, incompatible versions of her classification in parallel. Some layers treated her as a removed asset, some as an unresolved anomaly, some as a restricted lineage vector, and one, deep within governance architecture she had not directly accessed, flagged her as something closer to a continuity exception than an individual subject. That last classification flickered only briefly before collapsing, as if its existence exceeded allowable exposure thresholds. Sarah felt no emotional breakdown. Instead, she experienced a progressive loss of anchoring reference for self-definition. Not who she was, but what category of existence she belonged to in the system's logic. This was more destabilizing than rejection. Rejection still assumes identity continuity. This did not. This suggested that identity itself had never been singularly defined in the first place. A movement behind her drew her attention. The Alpha King was present, but not intrusively. His position in the corridor suggested observation without interference. Yet, even his presence now carried a different weight. Less stabilizing, more indicative. As if he too was reacting to something in her state that was beginning to deviate from expected parameters. He did not speak immediately. When he did, it was minimal. "You are starting to diverge from your recorded classification, not explanation, confirmation." Sarah turned slightly toward him. "What classification?" A pause followed that was longer than any she had observed from him before. Not hesitation in emotion, constraint in access. "That is no longer singular," he said. The sentence should have clarified something. Instead, it fractured the remaining stability of her internal model. No longer singular. The implication was not multiplicity as variation. It was multiplicity as structural fact. Her identity was not one thing misinterpreted by the system. It was multiple competing constructs being enforced simultaneously, none fully authorized to dominate the others. A deeper anomaly emerged beneath that realization. If her identity existed in parallel states within the system, then the question was no longer who she was. It was which version of her had been allowed to interact with Ironvale, and why that version had been selected for severance. For the first time, a structural inconsistency aligned across all prior observations. The archive fragmentation, the controlled exposure, the system delays, the biological recognition anomalies. They were not separate failures. They were consequences of a single unresolved classification conflict. Sarah looked down at her hand briefly, not as an emotional gesture, but as a verification attempt of physical continuity against cognitive instability. Her perception remained intact, but its reference system no longer was, and within that gap, something else surfaced. Not revelation, but suggestion, a trace of classification markers inconsistent with low bloodline designation. Not confirmed, not accessible in full, only visible as interference at the edge of system recognition. The Alpha King's gaze shifted slightly, not toward her, but toward the space where that anomaly registered, and for the first time, his expression carried something that resembled constraint pressure rather than neutrality, as if even he had just encountered a version of her that the system had not yet decided was permitted to exist. The chamber was not assembled for revelation. It was assembled for resolution. Unlike previous spaces Sarah had entered, this one carried no ambiguity in its design logic. Every structural element, elevated observation tiers, concentric seating alignment, and centralized verification platform, was engineered for a single purpose: to force a stable classification outcome from an inherently unstable variable. The presence of multiple factions was immediate. Court officials, lineage auditors, archival enforcers, and governance representatives occupied clearly stratified positions, not for ceremony, but for consensus enforcement. This was not a trial in the traditional sense. It was a cross-system verification convergence, where multiple institutional layers were brought into the same spatial frame to eliminate interpretive contradiction. Sarah was guided to the center without resistance, not because she was accepted, but because the system had already entered the phase where refusal of presence was no longer operationally meaningful. The Alpha King stood slightly behind and to the side, not as protector, not as presenter, but as constrained observer embedded within the same procedural architecture. His stillness carried a different weight here. It was not neutrality. It was limitation under visibility pressure. At the center, the verification interface activated. No spoken announcement preceded it, only activation. A circular resonance field expanded outward, intersecting every governing node in the chamber simultaneously. This was not a simple blood test or lineage scan. It was a multi-layer identity convergence protocol, designed to reconcile biological data, archival records, and structural governance classification into a single output. Sarah did not react externally. Internally, she registered the shift immediately. This was the system attempting final closure. The first phase initiated automatically. Biological resonance mapping. The air around her shifted subtly as the system attempted to align her presence with stored genetic templates across all registered lineages. Then came the second phase, archival correlation. Fragmented identity records from earlier systems, Ironvale court archives, restricted governance layers, were pulled into simultaneous evaluation. The third phase failed before completion, not due to absence of data, but due to conflict between datasets that refused convergence. A low-level instability ripple passed through the chamber. It was not loud, but it was observable. Officials adjusted their posture in response, not to her, but to the system's inability to stabilize output. Sarah remained still, but her perception had already shifted. This was not a verification of identity. It was an attempt to force identity into singularity. The system produced its first provisional classification, then immediately retracted it, then attempted a second, then a third. Each iteration collapsed faster than the previous one. This pattern did not indicate uncertainty. It indicated structural incompatibility between her existence and available classification architecture. Whispers began to form at the edges of the chamber. Not rebellion, not panic, but interpretive stress spreading through individuals who were witnessing a system fail to complete, a process it had never previously failed to resolve. The Alpha King's gaze shifted slightly toward the central interface. For the first time, his expression carried measurable constraint tension, not because of what the system was doing, but because of what it was failing to suppress. A fourth classification attempt emerged, different in structure from the others, deeper, older, not part of current governance architecture. The chamber reacted before the output fully rendered. Some officials stood instinctively, others froze, because the system had begun referencing classification layers that were not meant to be publicly accessible. Sarah saw only fragments, not full definition, only partial emergence of a term that did not belong to any recognized hierarchy. The interface flickered, and for a brief moment before immediate suppression, the system treated her not as low lineage, not as anomaly, not as asset, but as something that could not be safely categorized within existing bloodline logic at all. Then the output collapsed. Silence followed. Not procedural silence, but structural silence after failure. The system did not resolve her identity. It retracted its attempt to finalize it, and in that absence of resolution, every observer in the chamber reached the same unspoken conclusion. This was not an unknown subject. This was a subject the system had previously attempted, and failed, to define correctly. And that meant the real question was no longer whether she had value within the hierarchy. It was why the hierarchy itself could not complete its most fundamental act in her presence. The chamber did not descend into failure. It adapted. The moment the final classification attempt collapsed, there was no systemic alarm, no procedural shutdown, and no cascading instability across governance layers. Instead, the verification architecture entered a secondary operational state that was not publicly documented within standard court protocols. Sarah remained at the center of the chamber, still, observed, but no longer actively processed as a single evaluative target. What had just failed was not a scan. It was a convergence requirement. The system's expectation that all identity layers must resolve into one stable classification output. That requirement had been violated, not by error but by incompatibility, and the system responded accordingly. It did not shut down. It restructured the meaning of failure itself. The central interface flickered once, then stabilized. New classification streams began forming, not as correction of the previous output, but as parallel reinterpretations of it. Instead of choosing one identity result, the system generated multiple coexisting labels, each assigned to a different governance layer. At the biological level, unresolved lineage vector. At the administrative level, non-standard asset with restricted traceability. At the archival level, discontinuity subject flagged for historical reconstruction restriction. At a deeper, restricted governance layer, barely visible before suppression. The system attempted to assign a classification that did not align with any known hierarchy structure at all. But even that attempt was incomplete, because no single label could dominate long enough to stabilize the final output. This was not confusion. It was controlled divergence. Sarah observed the shift without movement. Her internal state remained detached, but not neutral. Something in her perception had begun to register a structural implication. The system was no longer trying to identify her correctly. It was trying to distribute her across multiple, incompatible definitions to prevent collapse of authority logic. Around her, the chamber did not erupt. It adjusted. Officials were not reacting to failure anymore. They were reacting to the emergence of a new operational reality. The system was refusing to produce a singular truth. Instead, it was maintaining multiple truths simultaneously. The Alpha King's expression tightened subtly, not with surprise, but with recognition pressure. His position did not change, but his stillness now carried constraint, tension that had not been present before. He understood what the system had just done, and more importantly, he understood what it had avoided doing. It had avoided acknowledging her as something outside classification entirely, because that would require acknowledging a category gap in governance itself. Instead, it chose the only viable alternative: relabel everything. Not to explain her, not to resolve her, but to prevent the system from collapsing under the necessity of defining her in a single, final form. Sarah felt it then, not emotionally, but structurally. Her existence was no longer being evaluated. It was being distributed across system logic to avoid forcing a singular conclusion. That realization created the first true fracture in her understanding of authority. because systems were not supposed to survive failed classification convergence. They were supposed to break. But this one did not break. It adapted around her, and in doing so, revealed a deeper truth beneath every anomaly she had witnessed so far. The system was not malfunctioning. It was actively choosing to remain operational by refusing to define her completely. And that meant whatever she was not an error to be corrected, but a condition the system had already learned it could not safely resolve. The chamber did not react as a single body. It fractured. The moment the system shifted into multi-layer reclassification, the unified interpretive response expected from the court collapsed into distributed uncertainty. This was not rebellion. It was not panic. It was something more structurally dangerous to governance stability. Inconsistent perception across identical stimuli. Different factions began processing the same event in incompatible ways. To lineage auditors, the system's output indicated a controlled anomaly requiring containment protocol escalation. To administrative officials, it suggested a classification inefficiency that could be resolved through delayed re-indexing. To archival observers, it resembled a historical discontinuity event, something that should not be occurring in the present governance cycle at all. But none of these interpretations aligned, and that lack of alignment produced the fracture. Sarah remained at the center of it, not as participant, but as the fixed point around which interpretive instability was propagating. She did not move, she did not speak, but she felt the shift in how she was being perceived, not as a unified subject, but as a distributed problem set being simultaneously interpreted by incompatible authority frameworks. The Alpha King's reaction was the first truly contained rupture. Externally, he remained still, no visible escalation, no intervention, no attempt to correct the system's output. But internally, something had shifted in his control state. For the first time, his stillness was no longer neutral. It was constrained, not by emotion in the conventional sense, but by structural containment of awareness. His gaze remained forward, but the focus within it tightened, as if he were tracking multiple system layers, collapsing into a configuration even he had not fully anticipated. He understood the direction this was moving, but understanding was no longer equivalent to control. The system was no longer producing a single narrative about her. It was producing competing truths, each valid within its own governance layer, each incompatible with the others. And Sarah began to notice something more precise beneath the fracture. The system was not struggling to define her identity. It was struggling to maintain coherence around the fact that her identity had been defined differently at multiple points in the system's own history. That inconsistency could not be resolved without revealing the source of contradiction. And the system was refusing that disclosure at every level, which meant the fracture was not caused by her presence alone. It was caused by what the system had previously recorded and then deliberately prevented from aligning into a single, accessible narrative. The Alpha King's voice did not break silence, but when it came, it carried a constrained pressure that had not been present before. Not explanation, not reassurance, a containment acknowledgement. This should not be happening at this scale. That was all. The statement confirmed what the system itself could no longer hide. Even its highest-level observers were now encountering limits in interpretive stability. And for Sarah, the implication finally consolidated into something irreversible. If the system could not agree on what she was, and if it had actively fragmented its own classification in order to remain operational, then the question was no longer about identity. It was about authorship of that instability. Because systems do not independently decide to erase consistency. They are instructed, or constrained, or corrected. And in that moment, beneath the fractured reactions of the court, beneath the constrained silence of the Alpha King, beneath the distributed collapse of unified perception. A final shift completed itself, not a revelation of who she was, but a structural inversion of the question itself. Not, who is she, but who decided she must not be one thing,